Hello my dear friends, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're exploring one of the darkest and most shocking stories hidden inside history, the story of John D. Rockefeller. Let's get started. At the height of his power, there were people in America who genuinely believed John D. Rockefeller was more dangerous than the government itself. Newspapers called him a monster in a suit. Small business owners whispered his name in fear. Competitors claimed that once Rockefeller targeted your company, your future was already over. Some even said he didn't simply destroy businesses, he destroyed entire lives. And yet, at the exact same time, millions of Americans admired him. Churches praised his donations. Politicians shook his hand behind closed doors. Universities accepted his money. To some, he was the greatest businessman in modern history. To others, he was the man who taught America that unlimited wealth could buy unlimited power. But the real story of Rockefeller is far darker than most people realize. Because the empire he built did not begin inside luxurious offices or grand mansions. It began inside a broken household filled with lies, instability, fear, and a young boy who slowly became obsessed with control. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York, long before America became the industrial giant we know today. His family lived modestly, and from the outside, they appeared relatively normal. But behind closed doors, the Rockefeller household was deeply unstable. His father, William Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman, at least that was the official story. In reality, many people believed he was a con artist. William traveled constantly, disappearing for weeks or even months at a time. He sold questionable, miracle medicines across rural America, often pretending to be a doctor despite having no medical training. Some towns reportedly called him Devil Bill. He lied easily, manipulated people naturally, and lived a double life for years. In some places, he was charming and charismatic. In others, he left behind angry customers and rumors of fraud. Young Rockefeller grew up watching all of this unfold. He watched his father cheat people. He watched money appear and disappear unpredictably. Most importantly, he learned one terrifying lesson very early in life: money meant survival. Without money, families suffered. Without control, chaos consumed everything. His mother, Eliza Rockefeller, was the complete opposite of his father. She was deeply religious, disciplined, and emotionally reserved. While William represented deception and unpredictability, Eliza represented strict self-control. She taught young Rockefeller to save every penny, avoid waste, and suppress emotion. Some historians later believed Rockefeller became emotionally cold because he spent his childhood trapped between a manipulative father and a deeply rigid mother. As a boy, Rockefeller already behaved differently from other children. While others played games, he kept detailed records of tiny financial transactions. He loaned money to neighbors for interest. He raised turkeys and calculated profits carefully. He wrote everything down in notebooks with obsessive precision. Every cent mattered to him. Every dollar had a purpose. That obsession with numbers slowly became an obsession with control. Rockefeller hated uncertainty. He hated disorder. He feared chaos more than almost anything else. And deep inside his mind, he began forming a belief that would later change America forever. If you controlled money, you controlled people. By the time Rockefeller became a young man, America itself was changing rapidly. Railroads were spreading across the country. Factories were growing. Cities expanded at shocking speed. The United States was transforming into an industrial machine, and a new class of businessmen was beginning to emerge, men who would become richer and more powerful than previous generations could have imagined. Then came oil. In the 1850s and 1860s, oil became the most valuable resource in America almost overnight. People discovered that petroleum could be refined into kerosene, which powered lamps and lit homes across the nation. Suddenly, everyone wanted to get rich from oil. Thousands of men rushed into the business. Entire towns exploded into existence around oil fields. Fortunes appeared overnight, and many disappeared just as quickly. Most people focused on drilling for oil. Rockefeller saw something different. He realized that drilling was unpredictable and dangerous. Some wells produced fortunes, others produced nothing, but refining oil, processing it into usable products, offered something far more valuable: control. Rockefeller understood that whoever controlled refining could eventually control the entire industry itself. That realization became the foundation of Standard Oil. Rockefeller entered the oil business quietly but strategically. Unlike many businessmen of the era, he rarely acted impulsively. He studied everything carefully. He analyzed costs obsessively. He negotiated relentlessly. While others celebrated sudden wealth, Rockefeller focused on efficiency, organization, and long-term domination. And then he began making secret deals. One of Rockefeller's most controversial strategies involved railroad companies. At the time, railroads controlled transportation across America. Oil companies depended on them to move products nationwide. Rockefeller secretly negotiated special transportation discounts for Standard Oil, allowing him to move oil far cheaper than his competitors. But according to many reports, the deals were even darker than that. Some railroad companies allegedly agreed not only to give Rockefeller discounted prices, but also to provide him with confidential information about rival businesses. Rockefeller could reportedly see how much oil competitors shipped, where they operated, and how vulnerable they were financially. In other words, he wasn't simply competing fairly in the market. He may have been gathering intelligence on an industrial battlefield. Competitors became confused and terrified. No matter how hard they worked, Standard Oil always seemed one step ahead. Smaller companies lost money rapidly while Rockefeller expanded with frightening speed. Some businessmen later claimed it felt like fighting an invisible enemy who already knew your every move. And Rockefeller showed very little mercy. If a refinery agreed to sell to Standard Oil, Rockefeller often rewarded the owners with company stock or partnerships. But if they resisted, things became much uglier. Prices suddenly dropped in their region. Transportation costs mysteriously increased. Credit disappeared. Business partners backed away. One by one, independent companies began collapsing under enormous pressure. Rockefeller rarely shouted. He rarely threatened people publicly. That was part of what made him so frightening. He remained calm, polite, and emotionally controlled even while destroying competitors behind the scenes. Some businessmen described meetings with him as deeply unsettling because Rockefeller spoke softly while discussing decisions that would financially ruin entire families. Then came what many historians later called the Cleveland Massacre. In the early 1870s, Rockefeller moved aggressively to dominate Cleveland's oil industry. Within a remarkably short period, Standard Oil either purchased or crushed most rival refineries in the city. Some owners surrendered quickly after realizing resistance was hopeless. Others fought desperately before eventually giving in. Stories began spreading across the business world. Men who had spent years building companies suddenly lost everything. Some reportedly broke down emotionally during negotiations. Others accepted Rockefeller's offers simply because they feared total destruction if they refused. Cleveland transformed from a competitive oil market into a territory increasingly controlled by one man. And Rockefeller believed he was right. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Rockefeller did not view himself as evil. In fact, he believed competition itself was inefficient and destructive. He convinced himself that monopolies created stability. He argued that Standard Oil lowered prices, improved organization, and modernized the industry. In his mind, eliminating competitors was not cruelty, it was progress. But for thousands of small business owners, that progress looked more like economic warfare. As Standard Oil expanded, Rockefeller's influence became enormous. By the late 19th century, the company controlled a staggering percentage of America's oil refining industry. Some estimates placed it near 90%. Imagine one corporation controlling almost an entire national industry. That level of power was almost unimaginable. And with power came fear. Newspapers increasingly portrayed Rockefeller as a symbol of unchecked greed. Political cartoonists drew him as a giant octopus wrapping its tentacles around America. Critics accused him of corrupting politicians and manipulating markets. Ordinary Americans began worrying that enormous corporations were becoming more powerful than democracy itself. But Rockefeller remained publicly calm through all of it. He spoke carefully. He dressed modestly. He projected the image of a disciplined Christian businessman. Yet behind that calm public image stood one of the most powerful financial empires the world had ever seen. Every railroad deal, every refinery purchase, every market collapse pushed Standard Oil closer to complete domination. And perhaps the most chilling part of all was this: Rockefeller still wasn't finished. Because while America believed Standard Oil was simply becoming a successful company, Rockefeller was quietly building something much larger, a network of influence stretching through banks, transportation systems, political circles, and eventually the very structure of American capitalism itself. The boy who once counted pennies in a small notebook was no longer simply chasing wealth. He was chasing control over an entire nation's future. As the 19th century came to an end, John D. Rockefeller was no longer just a businessman. He had become something far more unsettling. To millions of Americans, Rockefeller represented a new kind of power the world had never truly seen before, a billionaire powerful enough to influence industries, governments, markets, and perhaps even the direction of the country itself. Standard Oil had expanded so aggressively that many people felt trapped by it. Small refineries vanished. Competitors either surrendered or disappeared from the market entirely. Entire regions of America depended on Rockefeller's empire. By this point, Standard Oil touched almost every stage of the oil business: refining, transportation, pipelines, storage, distribution, and pricing. It was no longer just a company. It was a machine designed to dominate. And the American public was beginning to panic. Newspapers published terrifying political cartoons showing Rockefeller as a giant octopus wrapping its tentacles around the Capitol, railroads, and factories. Journalists accused him of crushing democracy through money and influence. Religious leaders questioned whether any man should possess such enormous wealth while ordinary workers struggled to survive. For the first time, Americans began seriously debating whether billionaires themselves posed a threat to the nation. But Rockefeller rarely reacted emotionally in public. That calmness only made him more mysterious. He appeared disciplined, controlled, almost mechanical. He spoke softly, avoided dramatic interviews, and projected the image of a deeply religious Christian man. Yet behind that quiet public persona existed one of the most feared corporate empires in history. Critics claimed Rockefeller's greatest weapon was not anger, it was patience. He could wait longer than competitors, negotiate harder than rivals, and slowly squeeze opponents until resistance became impossible. Behind closed doors, rumors about Rockefeller grew darker and darker. Some believed Standard Oil had secret influence inside banks and railroad companies. Others claimed politicians quietly protected Rockefeller because they depended on his money. There were whispers that certain government officials avoided challenging Standard Oil out of fear that financial retaliation could damage entire industries. Whether every accusation was true or not, one thing became clear: Rockefeller had accumulated so much power that Americans no longer trusted the system around him. And then, a woman named Ida Tarbell changed everything. Unlike most journalists of her time, Ida Tarbell was patient, intelligent, and relentless. She spent years investigating Standard Oil piece by piece. Her father himself had struggled against Rockefeller's growing empire, giving her a deeply personal understanding of what Standard Oil had done to smaller businesses. But Tarbell did not rely on emotional accusations alone. She gathered evidence carefully. She interviewed former employees. She examined business records and hidden deals. When her investigation was finally published, it exploded across America. Tarbell described secret railroad agreements, predatory business tactics, and systematic efforts to eliminate competition. For ordinary Americans, her writing felt shocking and deeply disturbing. Many already suspected Rockefeller had become too powerful, but Tarbell's reporting made those fears feel real. Suddenly, Standard Oil no longer looked like a symbol of progress. It looked like a symbol of corporate greed without limits. The pressure on Rockefeller intensified dramatically. Politicians could no longer ignore public outrage. Government investigators began examining Standard Oil more aggressively. Across the country, Americans debated whether monopolies were destroying the idea of fair competition itself. Rockefeller had spent decades building an empire so large that even the federal government now seemed unsure how to stop it. And yet Rockefeller still believed he was right. That belief remained one of the strangest aspects of his personality. Even while critics accused him of destroying livelihoods, Rockefeller insisted Standard Oil had actually helped America. He argued that the company lowered oil prices, improved efficiency, and brought order to a chaotic industry. In his mind, competition created waste and instability. Monopoly created control, and control created progress. But America was changing. By the early 20th century, fear of giant corporations had become a national political issue. Public anger toward monopolies continued growing, and eventually the United States government launched one of the most important legal battles in business history. The federal government sued Standard Oil under antitrust laws, accusing the company of illegally dominating the oil industry. The case became historic almost immediately. For years, lawyers, politicians, journalists, and businessmen watched the battle unfold. Many Americans hoped the government would finally weaken Rockefeller's empire. Others feared the consequences of attacking a corporation so deeply connected to the economy. Standard Oil had become so massive that breaking it apart felt almost impossible. But in 1911, the Supreme Court made its decision. Standard Oil would be broken up. After decades of expansion, secret deals, acquisitions, and domination, Rockefeller's empire officially faced destruction. Newspapers celebrated the ruling as a victory for democracy. Critics believed America had finally defeated corporate tyranny. Many assumed Rockefeller's power would now collapse. But something unexpected happened. The breakup actually made Rockefeller even richer. Because Rockefeller owned enormous amounts of stock in the companies created from Standard Oil's division, the value of his fortune skyrocketed. Instead of disappearing, his wealth expanded to levels almost unimaginable at the time. Companies that eventually became Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and other major oil corporations all emerged from Standard Oil's remains. In other words, even when the government tried to destroy Rockefeller's empire, the empire survived. That twist only strengthened Rockefeller's mythological image. To supporters, he looked like a financial genius who could not be defeated. To critics, he looked almost untouchable, a man who had built a system so powerful that even punishment turned into profit. And then Rockefeller began rewriting his public image. As he aged, he increasingly focused on philanthropy. He donated enormous amounts of money to schools, medical research, universities, churches, and charitable foundations. The University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and countless public health programs received massive financial support from his fortune. Millions of Americans began seeing a different version of Rockefeller, not the ruthless oil king, but the elderly billionaire giving away his wealth. But not everyone believed the transformation was genuine. Some critics argued Rockefeller's philanthropy was carefully designed to repair his reputation after decades of public hatred. Others believed he genuinely wanted to improve society after spending most of his life obsessed with business and control. The truth may have been somewhere in between. Rockefeller himself remained emotionally difficult to understand even until the very end of his life. He was known for strange habits that added to his mysterious reputation. He carefully counted his daily routines. He often appeared emotionally distant. Some people described him as polite but cold, generous but calculating. Even while donating millions, he still monitored details obsessively. It was as if the young boy who once tracked every penny in a notebook had never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, the world Rockefeller helped create continued expanding around him. The oil industry became one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Governments depended on it, wars depended on it, entire economies rose and fell because of it. Modern transportation, industrial growth, global trade, and military power all became tied to oil in ways previous generations could never have imagined. And standing at the beginning of that transformation was John D. Rockefeller. Some historians call him the greatest businessman in American history. Others describe him as the father of monopolistic capitalism. To this day, debates about Rockefeller remain deeply divided. Was he a visionary who modernized industry? Or was he a ruthless manipulator who taught corporations how to dominate society without mercy? Perhaps the answer is both. Because Rockefeller's true legacy was never just about oil. It was about power itself. He understood earlier than almost anyone else that modern wealth was no longer simply about owning products or land. Real power came from controlling systems, transportation systems, financial systems, supply chains, political influence, information, and markets. Rockefeller didn't merely build a successful company. He built a blueprint for modern corporate empires. And that blueprint still exists today. Many of the world's most powerful corporations operate using strategies remarkably similar to the ones Rockefeller perfected over a century ago. Aggressive acquisitions, market domination, political influence, quiet partnerships behind closed doors, public philanthropy combined with enormous private power. In many ways, the world created by Rockefeller never truly disappeared. It simply evolved. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937 at the age of 97, he had become one of the richest individuals in human history. Some estimates suggest that adjusted for inflation, his fortune may still rank among the largest ever accumulated. Yet even after death, the fascination surrounding him never ended. Because people still ask the same uncomfortable question today that Americans asked during Rockefeller's lifetime. How much power should one man be allowed to have? And perhaps that is why the story of John D. Rockefeller still feels so dark and unsettling even now. It is not only the story of one billionaire. It is the story of how wealth, fear, influence, and ambition combined to reshape an entire nation. The boy who once feared poverty became the man who helped define modern capitalism itself. And somewhere beneath the public image of the disciplined businessman and generous philanthropist, there may always remain the shadow of a man who discovered that controlling oil was only the beginning. Because true power came from controlling the world around it. Thank you for joining me on today's journey into one of history's darkest hidden stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next mystery hidden inside history.